Hello and welcome to the Headphone Show. This is a channel dedicated specifically to headphone reviews, DACs, amps, IEMs, anything to do with headphones. If you guys can see behind me, it's snowing, it's a blizzard. Normally this doesn't happen in this town, so yeah, some of you guys already know what my process is for reviewing headphones, what I consider neutral, what I care about, but for those of you guys who are new to this channel, this video is going to help explain some of that. I'm also going to go over a little bit of my source gear and what I use as a reference. So to begin with, as an example, if I'm reviewing the Odyssey LCD1, the first thing that I would look at is the build quality, design, and comfort. If it's not comfortable, if I can't wear it for more than a certain amount of time during the day, it generally won't be useful for me. And in case you guys are wondering, I spend most of my time sitting upright at my desk at my computer, and that's the application for headphones for me. The next thing I do is I go through the technical performance of a headphone, and while everything is related in terms of how things sound, I like to try and isolate the experience of different things, and so I'll try and put them into different categories, starting with detail retrieval. And for detail retrieval, again, this is not something that's necessarily conferred by instrument separation qualities from soundstage or an elevation in the treble at a certain range to try and enhance the perception of detail retrieval. What I'm focusing on with detail retrieval, or at least attempting to, is what I like to call internal detail retrieval, or the textural and structural definition for individual instrument lines, the clarity for the image representation. And I've also noticed that not everybody necessarily pays attention to this kind of stuff or even cares. I think most people probably only really pay attention to this kind of stuff after the fact, and the first thing they look for is tonality. But for me, I am comfortable doing a little bit of EQ to headphones, and while you can change the tonality, if there's a bit of grain or etch to certain parts of the frequency range, that's not something that you can really get back if the technical performance really can't do it. The next thing I focus on is speed. So this is going to be the immediacy of the leading edge, how tight something sounds, how snappy it sounds, and that's often also something that's more noticeable when something does poorly than when it's really, really good. But for example, a planar magnetic like this, the Odyssey LCD1, is often really, really tight in comparison to similarly priced dynamic headphones. But there are also dynamic headphones that, like the Focal Elegia, that are also very tight and snappy as well. The next thing I try and focus on is dynamics, which is a bit of a catch-all term right now because there's no clear definition for what these terms mean, but for my reviews, I like to think of it as the excursive capability of a headphone, so that's the punch or slam or impact that it has, and not all headphones do this the same way either. For example, the Focal Elegia here does that punch quality really, really well, and a lot of that just has to do with the physical capabilities of the drivers involved. It's that physical feeling of that impact and the intensity of that punch. So again, not dependent on frequency response, because that can also enhance the perception of the slam, but when you EQ things to a similar level, it doesn't quite stack up. The next thing I focus on is soundstage and imaging, and yes, this is an important category for me as well. It's just not the most important because I'm comfortable with headphones that don't have a crazy, super, wide and open soundstage like the HD800 and HD800S. So soundstage I consider to be how, speaker-like and spacious the presentation is, how big the images are, and how far back I am from it. And then also the imaging is the distribution of those images and how well placed they are and how evenly distributed things are all around me. So for some headphones like the ZMF Verite here, it's more of an all around me kind of thing. With the Focal Elegia, it's a really even distribution across the front of the stage. And then with the LCD1, which I haven't reviewed yet, but spoiler alert, there's not much for soundstage in the LCD1. It's just a very tight kind of headphone. And then moving on from there, I evaluate the tonality, and yes, again, I am comfortable doing a bit of EQ, but I don't want to overdo it. And my advice for anybody who's getting into EQ or wants to get into it would be to start with very minimal amounts and only really use wide Q values, because the frequency response that a given headphone has is often deliberately tuned in a certain way to make instruments be represented in a certain way as well. And when you start changing things too much, it can throw things off. So if you use a relatively wide Q value, so you're changing a wide range of frequencies, it can really help, because it won't as significantly impact those small and carefully tuned elements of the frequency response that's been specifically designed to sound a certain way. But when I'm evaluating a headphone's frequency response and tonality, I'm not specifically looking for whether or not it perfectly matches the consumer target curve, the Harman target. even though I think that the Harman target is a good target. So if a headphone does match it, I think that's great, but that's not the most important thing to me, because for me, neutral isn't necessarily that. For me, I actually consider neutral to be something a little bit brighter than the Harman target, so a little bit more treble energy there. And the bass elevation that the Harman target has, I also feel isn't necessary. It can be a lot of fun, especially for modern genres. I think it really just depends on the music that you're listening to. So if you're listening to, a lot of modern genres, a lot of, stuff with electric guitars, rock and pop and that kind of stuff, often the Harman target is going to be a lot better for it. But in my opinion, for music with a lot of pianos, a lot of string instruments, acoustic instruments, that will do better with a somewhat brighter tonality, with a little bit more energy, especially in the upper mid-range and lower treble, to be able to represent those instruments with ample clarity. And so really what I'm looking for the most with tonality is whether or not the headphone gets the tonal balance right for the instruments that it's meant to represent. To give you an example, if something is withdrawn or recessed in the lower treble and then emphasized or overemphasized in the upper treble, above 10K, 11K, 12K, that can throw off the way cymbals sound. And as an example, the Odyssey LCD4 is a headphone that does this. It's a great headphone, but it's also a headphone that's worth criticizing for its lack of tonal balance, because really it makes cymbal hits and percussive hits sound a little bit unrealistic. Same thing for other instruments as well, whether it's pianos or string instruments or guitars. And so really what I'm looking for is how well does the headphone represent these instruments? Is it throwing off the tonal balance for this? Is the upper edge of a certain type of instrument resonance or tone being withdrawn or emphasized to throw off the way that comes across? Or is it messing with vocals? That's where I'm focusing my scrutiny when it comes to frequency response and tonality, because really that's what it comes down to when we're actually listening to music on these headphones. And of course that means that I also look at measurements, and I do value measurements highly, so frequency response measurements, but by no means is this a substitute for actually trying out the headphone and listening to it. So I don't think it's possible to review a headphone just by looking at the frequency response. And as I mentioned earlier, everything is related, but you can't just hold up a frequency response and say, here's how the detail is in comparison to other headphones. It just doesn't work that way. You have to actually try the headphone, listen to the headphone, and then report your experience. On that subject, I do use the Mini DSP ears rig, but I have to stress that this is not industry standard, and it's certainly not as accurate as some of those head and torso simulators, either from Grass or B&K. Or what any of these really expensive ones are doing. I do find it useful for comparative purposes, but that's pretty much it. And even then, there are times when a headphone's driver sits at such an angle that it changes the way that comes across for this rig specifically, because again, the inner part of the silicon piece is not accurate to a human ear, the inner part of a human ear, so it's kind of missing an important gain factor there. If you're trying to compare frequency response that's been produced by something like a Mini DSP ears rig, it's important to also understand where the artifacts are and the issues are with this rig, so that you know which parts of the frequency response are actually valuable and which parts to throw out. Just to give you an example, anywhere around 4.5K hertz on the Mini DSP ears rig is not useful at all, because it shows up with a bump there on just about every measurement that you take. And then at the end of the day, I also want to be able to give a recommendation or discuss whether or not something is worth buying. Value is a difficult question to properly put a label on, because if you really care about that last tiny little 1% of detail or whatever it is, then the extra thousands of dollars that you pay to get it is of course worth it. But with that said, I do think it's important to compare different headphones within similar price brackets, because that's really what we're here for. We're trying to figure out, okay, if I had $900 to spend on a headphone, what would be the best headphone to get for my purposes, the things that I care about the most? And keep in mind that not everybody is going to have the same set of key requirements. Somebody might really value soundstage and image separation and distinction. Other people might not care about that at all and only want the best slam quality. Other people might say they're never going to EQ anything, and so they only want the most linear frequency response and tonality for the genres that they're listening to. So really, it's not something that's as simple as just saying this is the best one at $900 or this is the best one at $500 or whatever it is. It's really more a matter of saying, is this worth it at $900 if you have these key requirements? Sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. I also want to mention that it's important to go into headphone reviews without expecting to dislike it. In fact, it's probably best to approach it without having any knowledge of the context of, what's going on with it or what other people have said about it. because really that'll affect and impact the experience, and basically frame it in a way that just isn't going to be as representative of what the experience would be like if you knew nothing. It's also important to remember that people have different use cases for the headphones that they have. And so, for example, regardless of what I end up saying about the Odyssey LCD-1, the simple fact of this is that the LCD-1 is considerably more portable than either the ZMF Verite or the Focal Elegia here. It's just that's just the nature of this headphone. If your use case ends up being something that takes advantage of the portability here, then that's obviously going to change whether or not it's worth it for you. I use a number of different sources, amps and DACs, to review headphones on. I don't ever just use one because it may pair better with a different system. So at the moment I run headphones off of a Cayenne IHA6 if it requires quite a bit of power and current, like a lot of planar magnetic headphones do. I'll try and run it balanced if I can, if there's a balanced termination there. And then for the DAC, I'm currently using the IFI IDST Micro Black label, which uses the Burr Brown chips. And then because I also review amps and DACs and other things like that, a lot of that also comes through. So at the moment, for example, I'm running a lot of stuff off of the SPL Phonitor X and the IFI iCan Pro. There's also a Hugo 2 that I run stuff off, but at minimum there is enough power there from the IHA6 to drive just about any headphone out there. Now, as far as comparing headphones, I will generally try to have the headphones that I'm comparing in-house to be able to kind of A and B test them against each other, right away, because our auditory memory is not the greatest. But it is possible, if you've listened to a headphone long enough, to get a sense of what that sounds like. So, there will be occasionally times when I compare something to something that I've heard, from memory, and then I'll indicate it as such, because it really isn't the same as having them side by side and going with one and then going with the other. And I should also mention that it's really easy to get used to a certain sound signature, and it makes it so that our brain expects that sound signature. When we try something new, immediately, right away, it might not sound as good as it would once our brain has a chance to adjust to that new sound signature. And so that's why it's really important to spend quite a bit of time with a headphone before giving a final conclusion on it, because you can't just go from a headphone that you've been using for the last 6 months to something brand new and expect to fully understand the way that sounds and where it succeeds or where it fails. You need to spend a little bit more time with it than just the 30 minutes or whatever when you first put it on. And that's why for my reviews I will generally spend at least a week, at least ideally, with the headphone, and then put it through its paces, with various different genres of music, and see how it fits for my preferences. So yeah, that does it for this introduction. Check out some of the videos that I've been posting, and continue to keep an eye on this channel. If you like what I do, consider subscribing, and that way you get notified for when there's new videos that get released. Anyways, thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.